Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming this rather unique hour for a program of this nature. My name is Tom Gold. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's program. Our speaker is David Rank, former Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires and Acting Ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. Dave did his undergraduate work at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and like many of us, took a course in Asian history and got intrigued by the Asian field, and spontaneously, I don't know if that's the right word, applied for a fellowship from the Taiwan government and went to Taiwan and started studying Chinese with no background in it whatsoever. Again, like so many of us, he got hooked, and then ended up in the State Department with postings in Beijing, Shanghai, Taipei, and beside the Greater China Sphere, Athens, Kabul, and Port Louis, Mauritius. So he's really a major tour of the world. On June 2nd, he resigned from his position in the State Department in protest of the United States government, President Trump's decision for the U.S. to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change. This became a major event in world news, and many people are still discussing the implications of that for the United States, for U.S. relations with many other countries, and for the climate change agreement itself. So Dave is now on the lecture circuit, and we're very glad that he was able to come and join us this morning in Berkeley. This is already his second speech today. Wow. He spoke at 8 in the morning in Silicon Valley, and then the traffic gods, I think, blessed him. He was able to get up here in time for this presentation. Before we begin, I would like to thank Richard Palmer, Cal class of 1984, and one of my first students here, who has made this appearance by David Rank possible. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dave, who will talk about diplomacy, climate, and U.S.-China relations in the age of Trump.
Tom, thank you very much. I wish I could live up to the introduction you gave to me. I wish I could say that what led me to a career in China and in foreign service was a deep fascination with Chinese culture and Chinese language. I have to say a big part of it was being a history major and realizing as I drew to the end of my undergraduate career that I probably ought to find some kind of potentially marketable skill. And of course, this was in the mid-1980s when those of you of my generation or older will remember Japan was about to take over the world. And I had sort of missed that wave. It was too late to make myself a Japan person, so I thought, maybe I'll try China. Maybe that'll work. And it seems to have done okay. I guess the lesson to that being, you don't have to be right all the time. Just being right once sometimes is enough. And it has proven to be the case that, over the last 27 years since I took the Foreign Service test in 1989 and then joined the State Department in 1990, that the trajectory of China has really been beyond what my wildest prediction might have been as far as its emergence or reemergence as a global leader. There are a lot of things that I will not miss about being at our embassy in Beijing. Those of you who have spent time there know that it will be hard to miss the taste of the air or the smell of the water. As a diplomat, I won't miss the sound of the foreign ministry calling me late in the night to complain about something. I won't miss the sight of my BlackBerry blinking on the side of my bedstand when I go to bed, and blinking again when I wake up and at breakfast and lunch and dinner. But one of the things I'll miss the staff of the embassy. There were about 1,500 in Beijing and about 2,500 American and Chinese staff countrywide in the embassy. and the 5 consulates. And they are, in addition to being a really terrific bunch of people, they also did a terrific job of preparing someone like me to get up in front of a group like this and tell me what to say, insert a couple of humorous remarks that I should make to lighten up the atmosphere, and put together a complex schedule. Now I have me, a pale substitute for those 1,500 people. So I'm going to work off this well-crafted set of notes I have here. I hope I can do justice to the folks I worked with before. First of all, as Tom said, I left my job. I tendered my resignation on June 2nd. I left Beijing on June 6th. And usually, for those of you who've worked for the US government, you know that when you travel internationally, you sit in economy class. Usually the seats you get are next to the toilet in the back of the plane. And I decided that on my way out, I was gonna go out in a little more style than that. So I upgraded myself to the business class section, and I stretched out on that nice, comfortable chair. And I kind of thought it had been a busy 3 days between the 2nd of June when I had what I call my wife, my honey, I blew up the career moment, and the 6th of June when I left country. And I had to do things like say goodbye to a lot of people, some colleagues with whom I'd worked for more than 20 years. And I had to figure out what of the things in my apartment or our apartment would go back with us and what we'd leave behind. And I had to try to get the fellow who was replacing me up to speed on the sort of issues that I had been dealing with that he needed to know about. And so it didn't really leave much time to think about, gosh, how do I feel about all this? About the end of a 27-year career, about leaving a job that I truly loved, and leaving a group of colleagues who were truly a remarkable bunch of people. And I tried to feel bitter about it, but really the only emotion that I could feel was really a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude to the people I worked with, but mainly gratitude for having had the opportunity to do a remarkable number of things, to travel to a remarkable number of places, and most importantly, to have been entrusted by the people of the United States to represent them overseas for almost 3 decades. We don't get a chance, because we spend our careers overseas, we don't get a chance to say it very often, but thank you. It is a real honor for us to be able to do what we do, or what I did. I'm still having problems with verb tenses. So thank you, I appreciate it. So we got back. I got back to Washington, D.C., and I broke the news to my renter that he was no longer going to be my renter. But we had to give him a little time to extract himself from our house. And so my wife and I bought a car, and we decided to, since I no longer had a schedule I had to keep, to take advantage of the time I had to take a look at a country that I had represented, but I hadn't really had a chance to see for myself in a long time. So we drove from Washington, D.C. to what we think fondly of as the north coast of the United States. We have family connections and a tiny cabin in the woods near Lake Superior. And we drove from there through the Dakotas, through North Dakota, the part of the country that inspired Teddy Roosevelt to enact the really historic preservation of some of the most beautiful lands in the United States. We drove through Montana, big sky country. I visited my friend Max Baucus, who had been the ambassador before the turn in the administration. And then out to Seattle and Puget Sound and another remarkable part of the country. And then down this way, on the way to visiting a daughter at UCLA, we drove through the part of this country that inspired John Muir to eulogize some of the most beautiful parts of this entire planet. And it made me think about the extraordinary legacy that has been handed down to us as Americans, and the deep debt of gratitude that we owe to the people who were responsible for those things, to Teddy Roosevelt, to John Muir, to the people responsible for the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and the things that now we take for granted in the United States. But as we were traveling, we were also listening to the news, and we were looking out the windows of our Subaru, and the news was reporting on, for the first time in history, 2 Category 4 storms, Atlantic storms, hitting the United States in 1 year. And in fact, it happened in the space of 2 weeks, right? You had Hurricane Harvey, which dumped 37 trillion gallons of water on Houston in a 3-day period, more rain than Houston gets in an entire year. You had Hurricane Irma, the second largest tropical storm ever recorded in the Atlantic. The state of Montana that we drove through was on fire. From east to west, the air was choked with the smoke from the forest fires. The Central Valley was in a record heat wave as we drove down through California. And, I know climate scientists are very apprehensive about drawing connections between specific events and the impact of climate change. But I'm not a scientist, and it was really hard not to put what I saw and heard in the context of the decision I made to leave the service and the job I loved. That the impacts that we are having on this globe are, to me, undeniable, and they're startling. And this summer, even as I was enjoying the heritage we enjoy, it just really brought it home to me. So, since the topic is diplomacy and U.S.-China relations in the age of Trump, Tom, maybe I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But there is another question of legacy and heritage that really concerns me, and the moment we're in the United States right now, and it's the legacy of more than 70 years of bipartisan agreement that it's a good thing for the United States to be involved in the world, that it brings benefits not just to the United States, not just to the people of the United States, to American workers, but it is a positive for the rest of the world as well. And when I think about the decision by the United States to leave the Paris Agreement on climate change, the first thing I thought of as we left an organization, we left an agreement that essentially every other country in the world is a member of, and which essentially every other country in the world believes is the pressing issue of the coming century. It makes me think of that heritage of American leadership, and it made me think of a time, in September of 2001, I was working in the State Department as an assistant on the 7th floor, which is sort of where the bigwigs sit. I was not a bigwig. I was occasionally allowed to see bigwigs. I was a staff assistant dealing with Asia Pacific issues. And of course, September of 2001 was when the attacks of September 11th took place, and I was on my 7th floor, sitting in my 7th floor office, looking out the window, which looked out to the west over the Pentagon. And so I had I'm not quite sure what the word I should use, but I watched the plane crash into the south side of the Pentagon. And within minutes of that plane hitting the Pentagon, there was a very brief interval before all of us left the State Department because it wasn't clear where the next plane was going to hit. I got a call from a colleague from another country, a diplomat from another country, saying, Dave, whatever it is, whatever the United States needs from our government, you have it. And I can tell you as a diplomat, we don't make those sorts of commitments lightly. That when you're representing your country, you don't just pick up the phone and say, hey, if you need anything, just let me know. Because credibility is the only coin a diplomat has. If you cannot be credible in making commitments like that, then people will not listen to you. And it was clear to me that it was impossible for the person I was talking to have gotten the authorization from his capital to say, whatever you need, you have. It was also equally clear to me that he knew he was right, that he knew that he could offer the United States any assistance we needed and that his government would respond. He knew that because there was a 70-year history of American leadership. There was a 70-year history of American partnership in the world where the United States led and took part in cooperative efforts to take on challenges among nations. And as I thought about the decision to leave the Paris Agreement, I thought, gosh, would that same person pick up the phone now? You know, would the reaction among the partners and the partnerships that we developed over 70 years, how durable are those when we have stepped away from the single most important issue of this century? So you detect a sense of, you may detect a critical note in my voice towards the actions of the current administration, but my concern goes a little deeper, and because I've spent most of my career dealing with Asia and dealing with Asian issues, I was struck during the course of the last campaign that it's not really just an issue of the current administration, that the commitment to American engagement around the world, I think to some extent we've taken it for granted, just like I fear we sometimes take for granted the protections of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the legacy we were passed, that was passed to us in this country. Because I thought, when I was listening to the debate about what kind of country the United States wants to be, and are we an Asian Pacific country, or are we essentially a country of the Western Hemisphere, I watched really what was the debate was over was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and whether America would join an effort with 11 other countries to sort of set the rules for trade in the Asia Pacific. And as a person who has seen the benefits of an active American role in the world, the fact that neither Donald Trump, nor Hillary Clinton, nor Bernie Sanders, nor any of the major business organizations, nor any environmental groups who should have, and I suspect did, look at the environmental standards written into the TPP that would have extended American environmental protections throughout the part of the world with the most dynamic growth, or labor groups that would have seen an extension of American labor standards extended through the part of the world with the most dynamic economic growth, or the tech industry that would have seen an extension of American views on things like internet freedom, cross-border data flows, and a host of other areas where we have in the past been leaders, and now we find ourselves having absented us from the conversation. And it was disappointing and distressing that there was no one willing to stand up and talk about the benefits that those things bring to us, they bring to the region, and they bring to the world. I would leave it there, but I probably ought to end this on an optimistic note because Tom knows I am a native of Chicago. I was born on the south side of Chicago in a pretty unimpressive little town. And by rights, if you grow up on the south side of Chicago, you should be a Chicago White Sox fan. My father was a Chicago Cubs fan, however, and I inherited those genes from him. And to have those genes in your body means you're probably pretty well prepared for diplomacy. It makes you an optimist. It makes you take the long view of things, and it makes you realize that that there is value in having a motto, wait till next year. And so I leave it with, the bad news of leaving the Paris Agreement and undermining some of our relationships in the world is that it now removes the excuse. And I went into my assignment in Beijing with some reluctance, because it's not an easy place to live all the time, and it's a kind of a stressful job to be running an institution of a couple of thousand people in a place where we don't always see eye to eye. But as I was debating whether to go or not with my wife, my youngest kid came to me and said, "Look, Dad, if you can do anything to advance our efforts to fight climate change, then you have to go." And when your kid tells you that, you kind of have to go. So, that's the thought of then being a part of taking even no matter how incremental, being a part of extracting ourselves and chipping away at efforts to combat climate change was the reason I left my job. But the Cubs fan in me says leaving Paris perhaps has has a bright side to it. There's a silver lining to it. Is in signing Paris, I think people who looked at it recognized that it was just a down payment, that it wasn't enough, that we would need to do more anyway. And my concern that when we signed Paris was that people would sit back and say, it's done, it's taken care of, the government's on it, it's not our problem anymore. And that excuse has been taken away. So now, I didn't think of myself as a climate person going out, and I came back, and when I found myself at the end of a long day on June 2nd, having become a former government employee, I thought, wow, how did that happen? I'm not a climate guy. And as I got back, it's kind of dawned on me that we have now taken away that excuse, that we no longer have the opportunity to say, I'm not a climate guy, that the government is not on it, that it's going to be a personal responsibility to do what we can do on climate. It's going to be a responsibility at the organizational level, whether it's a university or an enterprise, whether it's a municipality or a state, that we're going to have to be climate people. So, Tom, thank you very much for having me here. I'd love to, I don't know how you want to work this, but it is a real honor to have had the chance to address this group. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there, you've got a hand, okay, good. Great, well, thanks a lot, Dave. There was an enormous number of really stimulating ideas that I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who have questions or comments. And I don't want to take up the rest of the time myself, even though I'm quite capable of that. But I have to remark on your reference to the Cubs, is that I think many of us here are Oakland A's fans. And the last couple of, I've been away for most of the summer, but the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of press about the great new players on the A's and how next year it's going to finally come together. I've been hearing that for about a decade now. But I think the A's and the Cubs may be meeting each other in the World Series before too long. Maybe there aren't enough A's fans in the room. I thought that would get a bigger response. Sorry about that. Clunk, kaboom. Warriors. That's another. Bring them back to Oakland. That's the. Anyway, as a sociologist, one of the things that I'm interested in is the construction, the social construction, and the necessity of reproducing and maintaining institutions, the things we take for granted. And I was really interested in your juxtaposing your experience with 9/11 with the withdrawal from the climate change agreement, because both of those are examples where we're going along and assuming that certain things, we can take them for granted, and suddenly, whomp, there's this breach, there's this disruption. And as sociologists, one of the things we're interested in is how do people put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? So after 9/11, there's been an effort to rethink international relations, the role of the United States, who are our friends, who are our enemies, those sorts of questions. So with the climate change issue, I think is just one example of what's going on, led by the disruptor-in-chief in Washington. Is that if you think about the speech at the UN yesterday, going along, some of it at a sort of a high level of, I don't know who wrote the script, but at a certain level of diplomacy and so on, and then suddenly talking about Rocket Man. I mean, it brings the whole level of discourse down to, I don't even know, I can't think of the correct noun to refer. You maybe have you're the diplomat, you may have a more diplomatic idea about, but I mean, there's so many things that we took for granted in terms of international relations, the U.S. role, what the nature of relations between the U.S. and other countries should be, including China, and now everything is up in the air. And who should be involved in the process of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again? And you mentioned narrative, I think you used the word narrative. This year on campus, we have a project called On the Same Page. And this year on campus, we're all supposed to be listening to and introducing in our courses the songs from Hamilton.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've been back, if you've had a chance to listen to it or see it yet, but maybe not. But the two of the key lines from there in the show are, who lives, who dies, who tells your story? And the other is taking control of the narrative. And so I think that one of the things that you're going around now and giving a speech like this and meeting with different groups is an effort to take control of the narrative, to raise our consciousness about a lot of these issues, not just about climate, but all these other questions about the U.S. role in the world. And so I really want to congratulate you on that, and thank you for that. So I don't know if I have a question in here, but if you want to, if any thoughts about what I have just said.
Well, now I have to go see Hamilton, right? Another thing on my checklist. Gosh, there is a lot to unpack there. One of the things which I didn't talk about, but which really concerns me, and is one of those, it's an issue that I don't think a lot of people pay attention to, but is kind of dear to my heart because I spent 30 years almost working with a really dedicated group of people in the federal government, is the erosion of competence in the federal government by a sustained, and it's, I think, in a particularly bad spot right now, but the feeling that public servants are on the liability side of the ledger and not on the asset side of the ledger. And I got to tell you, I never felt that way about the people I work with. They are, of course, a collection of human beings, some of whom are, they have the same foibles and weaknesses at times as people who work in almost any other field of human endeavor. But it is an extraordinary resource, the people I worked with, in terms of knowledge of the issues that affect the United States, in terms of commitment to advancing the interests of the United States, and in terms of the intellectual rigor and the backbone to stand up when there are bad decisions being made, to say you're making bad decisions. And sometimes it's not all that sexy to talk about the importance of a good bureaucracy, but it really is a key to the success of the United States over the last 70 years. A collection of people who understand issues and who are brave enough and confident enough and have the ability in the system we work in to say, Mr. President or Mr. Secretary or Madam Secretary, this is a bad idea. It's not going to be good for the United States. We tried this 10 years ago, etc. And what I'm concerned about, I've been concerned for a while, but that concern has accelerated in the last 8 months, is that we are in the process of driving away institutional knowledge and experience and wisdom and backbone that when we decide that we realize that being engaged in the world and leading the world as we have for the past 7 decades is a good idea, that we're going to be short some of the muscle memory and the institutional knowledge to be as effective as we will need to be, because already, it is a very complicated world, and it was a challenge conducting the business of the United States, even in the best of situation. So I fear that when we return from this idyll of introspection, that we're making the challenge by the act of driving away some really talented people. And by the way, I'm not talking about myself but I'm talking about people who have been in 5 and 10 years and who will continue a career, hopefully as long as my career was before I left, that we're not going to have the ability to do so. And since I've got the microphone, I want to tell one anecdote about, because there's a number of students in the audience, and I've had a number of people ask me, gosh, do I want to go into government service? Gosh, do I want to join the Foreign Service? When I left the embassy, I said, look, I'm the only person in this embassy who is allowed to leave. Everyone else has to stay for exactly the reasons I just talked about. And the same goes for people who are considering a career in government. It is essential that we have good people who are committed to and want to do the work of the people. It is, the U.S. government is a large, complicated, at times exceedingly frustrating place to work, but is a place where people at very junior levels can have extraordinary impact on American interests and, frankly, on the world. And the example that comes to mind most immediately and most directly comes from my personal experience. I wish I could claim any credit for it, but there was a fella at the embassy the first time I worked there, the embassy in Beijing in the late 90s, who said, we really ought to know what's in the air we're breathing here in Beijing. And not only should we know that there's a law, there's a requirement that if we make information available to American government personnel, that we have to make the same information available to ordinary American citizens. It's called no double standard. So if we're going to make the information about what's in the air in Beijing available to people in the embassy, then we're going to have to make it available, and we should make it available to ordinary Americans who are traveling to China so they know what they're breathing. And it took a long time to convince people within the sort of management structure of the embassy that was a good idea, that was something that should be done. Not because they didn't think it was a good idea, but because they knew it would be an extremely unpopular decision with the Chinese government. And it proved to be an extremely unpopular decision with the Chinese government. For a long time, our website was blocked. No one could have access to it because they didn't want that information out there, because they knew they didn't want ordinary people knowing the disturbing fact of what they were breathing every day. But the embassy persisted, and it took a long time, but eventually the city of Beijing and the Chinese central government lifted the block on the U.S. Embassy website, and very quickly ordinary Chinese looked to the American Embassy website as a way of getting a sense of what is it we're breathing. And it didn't take very long from that for ordinary Chinese to say, well, how come our government's not doing this? And it didn't take very long from that for the city of Beijing and the central government to say, yeah, you know what, this is the kind of information we are obligated to provide our citizens. So now if you travel to China, just about anywhere in China, You can go online, you can find what the air quality is through a nationwide set of air quality monitors. But not only China, you can go to India, you can go to Indonesia, you can go to the United States, and there's essentially a global network of air quality monitoring stations, easily accessible to anyone who has access to the internet. And it is essentially because of that one guy sitting in the embassy in Beijing who had worked for less than 5 years for the US government. It is a remarkable testament to what a good idea can do, and it doesn't really matter who has it. So there you go.
Do you want to take charge of calling them?
Sure, I'd love to. Here we go.
You've talked a little bit about influencing the Chinese government. Can you tell us more about influencing the U.S. government from inside the embassy? Presumably something like climate change is a bit above your pay grade, and you're not going to convince them to change their policy on that. So you have a binary choice of either staying or leaving. But can you give us some examples of other places where from inside the embassy a pushback against policy or policy implementation made a difference?
Sure. I'll give you my experience. It was both in Kabul, in the embassy in Afghanistan, but also then when I returned, I took over as the director of our Office of Afghan Affairs. And President Obama, when he was elected, made it clear that he wanted to leave Afghanistan by the time he was by the end of his second term. And so there's a very complex system of how policy ideas are formulated and then conveyed up the foreign policy process up so the president can make decisions. It's, I think, not quite as functional in this administration, but in the Obama administration, it was exceedingly rigorous. You'd have a meeting at the sort of lowest level, they'd pass it up until it was teed up for the National Security Council and the president to decide. And our job as civil servants was not to, there was the clear expectation or hope that the bureaucracy would come up with a formulation that said, if we leave, it will be okay. That Afghanistan will remain stable, and that we will be able to sort of chalk it up as a success. And there was a lot of pressure from the political side of the White House to make that happen. It wasn't direct pressure, but it was pretty clear as explanations of why there would be problems if we left on that kind of a timetable. But the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the intelligence community, who were really charged with making that assessment, it sort of persevered in the insistence that, look, it's not our call as civil servants to say whether we should remain in Afghanistan or not, but it is our responsibility as people who have spent a lot of time working on the issues, who understand what's going on the ground, to say that that, first of all, that's a political decision. Only an elected politician can make the decision of whether we stay or go. But it was important to make it clear that it would have clear implications were we to leave on the timeline that the White House was pushing for. That I think what you're asking about is, what's the embassy's role, or what's the civil service, the civil servant's role, and it's to draw on your experience and your knowledge of what's happened in the past, and tee up what are essentially political decisions like that. It's not shirking of responsibility, but that's in our system. That's, I think, the appropriate way to tee up those decisions. On the question of climate change, we tried through a number of means to highlight the downsides of withdrawing from Paris. This was before the decision was made, including the, I think, kind of ironic situation that our departure from the Paris Agreement is likely to slow down Chinese efforts to reduce support for their steel industry, which is one of the main focuses of this government, because One of the biggest sticks the Chinese government has used to reform its economy has been pressure from the outside, has been its international commitments. And the commitments China has made under the Paris Agreement will be a lot easier. The economic reformers in China look to those commitments as a way of looking at the inefficient steel sector or aluminum and coal and urging them to either get more efficient or, more likely, find more productive ways of doing business. With that pressure of the United States as a counterweight to China in the Paris Agreement, I suspect there's going to be less pressure for that sort of reform. Sure.
Yes, you're probably aware of the leadership of the governor of California and its subnational agreements with other states and nations to support or uphold the Paris Climate Agreement. Would you comment about the impact of that? I know our governor has met in China and that more than 200 Chinese scientists have come here. There is an exchange with regard to better energy standards and such.
Yeah, I mean, I think California has been a leader for a long time on that sort of issue. I suspect that California's role will be even more important, and there is one of the things the United States, and I think it has been a positive contribution, is to push for a global system that is based on multilateral organizations and shared standards and common rules. And California has, because of its economic heft and because of its willingness to lean forward on issues like that, has the ability, certainly within the United States, that it's hard to do business in the United States and not make California part of your strategy. So by setting standards that require more from companies in terms of climate action, California has the ability to influence the national conversation. And then by taking his show on the road, as your governor has, he has the ability to, I think it's probably less effective than having an American president do that, but we are in the situation where sometimes you have to settle for second best solution. So I think that sort of leadership will be essential, not just from California, but from a number of other states and municipalities. I think it's a really positive thing.
Mr. Ambassador, first of all, thank you for your fortitude and your sense of principle. I mean, you represent the best at speaking truth to power. And many of us, of course, are very concerned about the issue of climate change, but I wonder whether the issue of how we deal with a rising, aggressive China that clearly wants us out of Asia, how do we handle that situation without, somebody doing something really stupid on either end that turns into a disaster?
Right. I am all for not doing stupid things. I talked at the end of my shtick, I talked a little bit about the TPP, and I think the Obama administration had it right on the rebalance to Asia. If you look closely at that strategy, it essentially said, right now as a country, as a nation, we are investing an incredible amount of energy and resources and focus on the Middle East. And that's not the most productive place to invest our energies. That the Asian Pacific region is going to be the center of global dynamism in the next 100 years, and that's where we should be putting our focus. And it was a multi-pronged strategy of rebalancing the efforts we have, including a security element, political elements of strengthening our relationships with groups like ASEAN and as well as bilateral ties. And then the third leg in that stool was TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I don't think the region really wants us to be there just in a security, just the security element of our presence. What they're interested in fundamentally is a long-term, bipartisan commitment to a rules-based trading system. And while I think the Obama administration's overall strategy of rebalancing our foreign policy to Asia was a good one, I'm kind of critical of the strategy for passage of TPP. As I was saying earlier, there was not a lot of courage on either side of our political discussion, nor among the business community, to talk about the benefits of trade to the United States. And the strategy that appeared to be the administration appeared to be working on was to hope that Hillary Clinton won, and then to push through TPP passage in lame duck session. And it was even had she won, would have been a very challenging prospect. But of course, she didn't win, and so and that's a big problem. I mean, that's to have such a critical element of your strategy hinge on such a slender reed is a really significant strategic mistake. I think if we decide as a nation that we want to be a global leader and we want to be an Asian Pacific power, we're going to have to come back to the TPP or something very like it, because it is our anchor to the region. It is our counter to a Chinese view of how those relations should be conducted, and it's the way to channel as you rightly say, a competitive relationship with the other major power in the world into a more productive channel than military competition. I'm just going to work my way across the room.
Hi Dave, I'm visiting from Australia. That was probably an Australian on the end of it.
It was an Australian on the end of it.
Yeah, I didn't need to tell me. With energy policy in Australia is in disarray, dreadfully, across both political parties, and our immediate former Prime Minister, because we've got quite a few former Prime Ministers in the pipeline, has said, well, Paris really, was not a straitjacket. You just it's a nice idea and you can take a bit of notice of it. The withdrawal from Paris by the US has emboldened opponents of climate policy dramatically in our country. And at the same time, of course, our relationship with China is profoundly underpinning our economy. So you talk about the US withdrawing from leadership, but in that withdrawal, you unleash and embolden people who want to act in particular ways. And I wonder if you can unpack some of that, and how you're going to go back and reclaim some of that. And the speech to the General Assembly yesterday, I'm not sure you'll get the same phone call when you go into North Korea.
Right. I mean, I wish there were points in your presentation I could pick apart and say I fundamentally disagree with. My response to Australian politicians or Australians who are betting on extractives and hydrocarbons, that it would be the same response I'd have to Americans who are betting on them. I mean, if you talk, you don't have to talk to me, I don't know this stuff, but if you talk to Americans in the energy sector, if you talk to American businesses, if you talk to American entrepreneurs, they say, the parts of the economy we should be looking at are clean energy, not because it's because it's smart economically. We should be looking at sort of the economy of the future. And that's the real challenge, I mean, economically, is that China's taken a long-term view of these things, and I think a very prudent and I think it's a pretty sensible assessment of, what are the strategic high grounds, both in terms of economic competitiveness, but also in the terms of the sort of old strategic sense, the old sense of the word strategic. And they've laid out a very sort of well thought out plan to dominate those. And that's going to, if we don't sort of rethink our approach, it's going to put us in a really tough position. My advice would be to probably that's not a good thing for us. So we should take a look at the direction we're headed, and the emphasis that we have chosen to make. I don't think that's probably an argument that will go down very well right now in the United States, but I think it's one we're going to have to come back to because, and I suspect you're going to have to come back to it in Australia. Thanks.
The Trump administration has a miserable record of refilling high-level diplomatic posts and senior posts in the Department of State as well. If you have any statistics on this, I'd welcome them. We don't even have an ambassador in Afghanistan. Under those circumstances, I wonder if you took into account when you resigned the fact that you are leaving the embassy in Beijing, not only without an ambassador, but with a deputy ambassador, an acting ambassador, ceding that position to a relatively junior person who would not, I suggest, have much credibility either in Beijing or in Washington. Isn't it true that Foreign Service officers expect that sometime during their career, they're going to be asked to support policies of administrations in Washington with which they disagree? And I wondered if you'd reflect on that.
Sure, absolutely. No, you have in a lot of ways summarized at least a part of the thoughts that went through my mind as I was making my decision. First of all, the failure or the delay in filling a lot of senior positions, that worries me a lot less than a lot of other things that have gone on, frankly, because those positions are being filled by a lot of competent people in temporary positions, people who are career civil servants who've been dealing with the specific issues that are out there. What it does from an administration perspective is it makes it harder for an administration to implement its view of policy. So I know when I was the acting ambassador in Beijing, it's very clearly I was in a caretaker position, and there were very few new policies that I was certainly going to propose or implement, but I was pretty confident that I knew how to carry on the work that had been going on. On the specific question of leaving a relatively junior person behind me, I mean, just as a very practical fact, the person who filled in behind me, I'm not sure why I had my job and he had his in the first place. So there is an extraordinarily, our mission in China is extraordinarily lucky to have a group of people who have served many, many years in the country, who are deeply involved in or have been deeply involved in what's been going on between the United States and China. And so while that was a consideration, my bigger consideration was the impact it would have on a younger generation, of a senior person leaving. My hope was, as I told the staff at the embassy, was that my departure would send a signal on behalf of a lot of people who felt the same way, but who knew that they would have to stick around to do some of the cleanup work in the years and decades to come. But I couldn't agree more with some of the considerations you talk about. I think you had.
Well, along those lines, I just have to add a somewhat pessimistic footnote, and that is that in one of the very recent articles in New York Magazine, there's a very long essay written by someone who watched and looked into the changes in the Department of Energy, and just found and suggests that there is going to be wholesale changes in policy attempted, which is not a surprise, but the question is how long the effects would be on policy, particularly energy policy, and also on the personnel who are left behind.
I haven't seen the article, but absolutely, right? I mean, it's sort of the old saw of elections have consequences. This will have far-reaching consequences, and I happen to have good friends in the Department of Energy and got to know a lot of people in the Department of Energy in the Obama administration because expanding clean energy research and cooperation with China was a big focus of what the administration was working on. And they have told me it's tough, that the shift from a focus on clean energy and research on future energy sources to a more traditional extractive view of the Department of Energy's government's mandate, that is indeed a fact, and I mean their sense is that it will set us back pretty considerably.
Can I take advantage of the microphone being here and come back to your U.S.-China role and your role in the embassy? And as you know, even if we don't account for the sort of Steve Bannon types, among Asia specialists, there's been a lot of questioning in recent years of the success and failures of the policy of engagement, whether it's international intellectual property or international trade or South China Seas or human rights or Korea or whatever. A lot of Asia specialists included are saying this engagement policy has not worked and we need to rethink it. And you've watched that from the embassy, and I would just like to hear your thoughts on some of those questioning of the policy of engagement with a government that doesn't seem to want to play by the rules of the rest of the international community.
Right, I would, absolutely. There's been a lot of reflection both in the popular press, among think tanks, and within the sort of federal government system of how do we, what do we know now that we know now to be wrong that we assumed or thought 20, 30 years ago. And I will say, 20 years ago there was the sort of, I first started in China in 1990, the year after the Tiananmen massacre, and there was the idea then that this place is unsustainable, that it's lost legitimacy, a regime that used force against its own citizens in the way it did could not survive long. Of course, this is in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so there was sort of a historical parallel. And so the assumption was that as we engaged economically, that China would, and China opened economically, that it would naturally lead the country to open politically and develop political systems and processes that weren't identical to those in the West, but at least were along the same lines. I mean, clearly that underlying assumption or way of thinking has proved to a large extent. I mean, China has, its political system has changed remarkably, but in general, China, the level of convergence has not been, it's been limited, right? But I guess I would a little bit take issue with well, first of all, it is a counterfactual argument. I mean, we did engage, and China has returned to, or is in the process of returning to what has historically been its position in the world, of one of the predominant nations, and certainly the predominant nation in that part of the world. My hunch is that that was almost, once the Chinese government shifted from a focus on politics to a focus on economic growth and unleashed the potential of that society, that return was, that was a more or less inevitable thing. We could presumably have fought to prevent China's economic rise. We could have kept them out of the WTO. We could have maintained sort of a draconian regime to prevent their return to the international economic system. My sense is that probably would not have worked, and my sense is that it would have been exceedingly hard to implement that kind of a policy. In other words, to get the rest of the world to keep China out of the global trading system. And so what the Obama administration spent its time doing, and I think very usefully, was two things. One, to continue to work and a painstaking, frustrating, and what you talk about, as far as trade rules, to get China to adhere to the global set of trade rules, or to at least identify specific problems and work those out. And at the same, with a goal of, to the extent possible, integrating China into existing systems, where not possible to identify what the specific areas are, where we're going to have to readjust the system for a country that is simply larger than the original system was designed to accommodate. And the other half of the Obama administration strategy, which I think was a wise one, was to, as that process was going on, was to look to the expanding influence of China and find ways that we can expand our cooperation with them in the rest of the world. So, you know, I was really struck when I went back to Beijing between my second and third assignments there. So I left in 2008 and then got back there for the third time in 2016, was the expansion of cooperation in the sort of non-foreign affairs agencies of our country. So, you know, the CDC and the Chinese CDC were working together in West Africa fighting Ebola. Department of Energy had a gigantic range of cooperative programs, both looking at things like climate change, but also working on non-proliferation, securing nuclear sources outside in third countries, so in other parts of the world where there were nuclear, either for medical purposes or other purposes, nuclear facilities. We work together to prevent the spread of the loss of fissile or nuclear material from those places. And just a whole list of, it would take too long to run through them, of things that you don't hear about ordinarily when you're talking about U.S.-China relations, but really were a remarkable change, and I think a remarkably positive underpinning to the relationship. Not to say that those would mitigate the trade concerns that I think are going to be a real problem. How do we as the United States, and how does the international system that benefits us, that benefits the rest of the world, and I think benefits China, how are they going to incorporate a decidedly different view of how the world should be run economically?
Kind of going off your last answer, you talked about in the past the kind of expectations of how China would sort of converge more with Western kind of political ideologies. Could you speak a little bit about expectations for China's future? Do you see the Chinese state, shifting politically more towards that convergence, or do you see it continuing down the path that it has been, especially with Xi Jinping and recent changes?
Right. I have to say, despite being a Cubs fan, I'm not really optimistic. I've been struck by just how much less space there was for civil society, for personal expression in 2016, 2017 than there had been certainly 2 decades ago, and even a few years from today. And my impression is, or at least this is just sort of my personal analysis, is that there is which I think is wishful thinking, the view that Xi Jinping spent the last 5 years consolidating his power, making sure he had firm control of the levers of the state, so that in his second term as General Secretary, he would then move on areas of economic reform and other reforms to make China a more open society. That is a delightful thing to think. It just seems, I haven't seen the evidence to support it. So I am, at least in the midterm, I'm not much of an optimist. I'm afraid that we will see more of the same with Xi in his next 5-year term as General Secretary.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak with us today. I'm particularly curious to hear about your personal view on dialogue mechanisms such as the strategic and economic dialogue, and then recently going forward it has been changed into a new format. The way I see it, it's just been repeated commitments made over a series of several consecutive years and not a lot of concrete progress made on this regard. Do you have any suggestions going forward on how we can break away from this pattern and move to a new pattern where there is less repeated commitments and more concrete action taken? Thank you.
Right. To some extent, I mean, anyone who worked on China issues over the last, I guess, probably 15 years. The thought of the strategic dialogue or the strategic economic dialogue, or then it evolved to the strategic and economic dialogue, it was with unalloyed horror the thought of getting ready for one of those dialogues. They were huge enterprises involving dozens of senior officials coming over, spending far too little time talking about some issues that are exceedingly important. And so I find myself in the odd position of being a little nostalgic for them, because not because they were solving the big issues, but I don't think our inability to solve big issues between the US and China is primarily because we have the wrong dialogue structure. It's because we just have fundamentally different views on those issues. But you know, the SNED was pretty good at getting progress on little things. And I'm going to throw in to the SNED, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, what's called the JCCT, the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, which is a similar one on very technical trade issues. And they were pretty good at getting sort of attention put to second-tier issues. I think of the last SNED that was held in Beijing in June of 2016, where we made progress on wildlife trafficking and ocean preservation. These are an awful lot of stuff on climate, on some really important issues that aren't really on the front burner. The SNED also, although we haven't finished an agreement on investment, it was through the SNED process that the Chinese, for the first time, agreed to pursue an investment agreement on the basis of what's called a negative list. In other words, the Chinese would put forward, rather than saying, here's a list of what you are allowed to invest in, they agreed to turn that around and say, we will negotiate on the basis of a list of just the sectors where American investors are not allowed to participate. Now, that sounds like, that may sound boring to you, to a trade negotiator that warms the cockles of their hearts. There was a lot of work to go. When I was at the embassy, the negative list that the Chinese had provided was 88 pages long. So we weren't there yet. We probably had a couple of SNEDs left in us before we reached an agreement. But it provided a framework for at least advancing those sorts of things. The new administration has come in and sort of changed some of the nomenclature and has now identified 4 high-level dialogues that they want to use. My hunch is, to the extent that we're looking to have a broad, comprehensive bilateral relationship with China, we're going to come back to some version of that, even if the names aren't changed. In part because there is a need for addressing those second-tier issues, but also in part because the way the Chinese system works, sometimes the only way to get the right bureaucratic actors in the room is to have someone from outside show up. And I think we're going to find that without a dialogue like the SNED or those sub-dialogues that went with it, we're not going to be getting the right people in the room. And there's no guarantee getting them in the room will provide satisfaction, but there is a guarantee that if you can't talk to the right people, you're not going to get to an answer.
I really like your comment on credibility and commitment of the United States, to the point where I put like a double star next to my notes on credibility and commitment of the United States in my notes. Yeah. So I am curious about how, after the United States withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement and even from TPP, what are the roles of other international organizations, other actors like nonprofit organizations or even private sectors? What is the potential role that they can play to kind of take the first step to rebuild the U.S. credibility?
It's important, and I think most countries in the world understand that we have a big, complex system, and that Washington has an important thing, important voice in defining what the United States is, but it's not the only voice. It was interesting. I was down in Silicon Valley this morning, and the perspectives you get from investors and people in the tech industry are really different from believe it or not, from what you hear from folks like me in Washington. But ultimately, there's a limit to how much, the only way to rebuild a government's credibility is for that government to rebuild its credibility. In other words, I think there are a lot of people around the world, a lot of Europeans who look at the United States and are dismayed at the decision to withdraw from Paris, but they understand that there's great work being done by the state of California, that there are investors, I'm just thinking of energy investors doing really interesting things and researchers on climate. But I'm just not sure that on the question of credibility, on the question of is someone going to pick up the phone on the next September 11th and say, we got your back, that's unlikely to help in that process. I think right here.
So as you had stated in your discussion that you're worried and apprehensive about what happens to people who are exiting civil service in this time of introversion and isolationism. What do people who are exiting do to communicate to the next generation of potential civil servants, or what do they do in the private sector in the meantime? Much in your own journey in this.
Are you offering me a job? No, look, the people that I'm most concerned about are going to do great. I think that I don't worry about, the people I'm worried about us losing are the people who are going to have no problem finding interesting things to do in other parts of the U.S. system, whether it's working commercial enterprises, whether it's working in NGOs or academia, or a whole bunch of different things. My concern is I want them working for me, right? I want them. I think they are an extraordinary resource, and I think we ought to try to be hanging on to them as much as possible. My other worry is, I look at because it's kind of close to my heart, the Foreign Service, and I worry about good people saying, I don't want to do that, and this gentleman asking the question about, or making the very accurate point that part of the obligation of a government employee, and certainly of the Foreign Service, a disciplined service, is you will be asked to do things with which you disagree. And that is absolutely true. In my particular case, there was nowhere to pass the buck anymore, and faced with something where I so fundamentally disagreed, the only thing I could really do was leave. That's not the case for people coming in. There are lots of ways to convey your unwillingness or your concern about a bad policy decision, and I think I wouldn't, my strong urging to people who are considering a career in government, considering a career in the Foreign Service, is this: yes, you will be asked to do things with which you disagree. You still have to take that job. You still have to do it because we will need people who are willing to look at an issue, willing to have a strong opinion on it, and express that strong opinion despite the fact that it is unpopular and it is contrary to a current administration, and do it in a disciplined way. In other words, not in front of a group like this, but through the channels that exist to do it. To lose that argument and to remain in service, to remain disciplined, and understand that a time will come when either you will be proven wrong and your advice was incorrect, or you will be proven right, and we will need people not to say I told you so, but to sort of recover from the damage, hopefully not severe, that has been made through bad policy decisions.
I think we're up out.
for about,
We've worked you,
wow.
we worked you pretty hard. And I think you've we've covered a huge number of issues, and I really want to thank you for your honesty and forthrightness in addressing a lot of really sensitive issues. And the takeaway, on the one hand, on the other hand, I mean, there's a lot of frustrating issues, a lot of frustrating things that many of us, especially young people in the room, are facing in terms of career choices and can I make a difference? And, you're speaking at Berkeley. And so much of what the self-selection of students who come here is that they want to change the world. And what are the best channels in order to do that? And I think you've really given us a lot of things to chew on in terms of how do we persist, and if we run up against a wall in one area, then how do we find other channels that we can pursue to try to implement our ideals and to try to work together to create a better and more peaceful world. So thank you again, Dave, very much for spending the time with us, and on behalf of the audience, wish you all the best and continue your tour of the United States, hopefully by car, on land, so that the flyover states will not be flown over, but that you'll be able to share this message throughout our great country. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity. I appreciate it.